Continue.
Okay, this is chapter 4, and I'll start with the summary. Savasti meets Sujata for the first time, and Sujata is the daughter of the village chief that the village that Savasti lives in. And Siddhartha tells them the story about the time the swan was shot down by Devadatta's arrow. So Savasti brought his own rice. It was planning to eat his rice with the Buddha. And the Buddha graciously offered to combine the rice of Sujata with Savasti, and they ate it together. And there's a beautiful symbolism here, is that the rice that Savasti bought was very brown and very coarse because it was poor, while the rice that Sujata brought was white and soft because she came from a much better social standing than Savasti. So her rice was, you could say, much better quality. Yet the Buddha combined the rice together, showing that despite the fact that Savasti might come from the untouchable caste, and Sujata, the daughter of the village chief, they are still made of the same substance. What do I mean by same substance? It means that they are still human beings. Whether you're poor or whether you're rich, you are still a human being. And the Buddha recognized that. And so he's trying to teach them a lesson at that very moment. So whether it is brown rice or whether it's white rice, it's still rice, meaning that we're still human beings, and we should treat each other with equality and not discriminate people based on their skin color or even their sexual orientation. So that is the lesson that in that particular interaction the Buddha was trying to teach them. The Buddha also taught Savasti to be mindful when one eats and when one drinks water. What does it mean to be mindful? It means to do things with intention and purpose, and not mindlessly. We should do things with logic and with wisdom. So when one practices mindfulness, whether it be eating or doing chore, they shouldn't be in a rush to get things done, and yet at the same time they shouldn't be relaxed and lazy about it either. Everything must be well thought out, and we should do things with happiness and fulfillment. So developing this type of awareness will allow us to simply try our best and not worry about what we can't do. So like we talked about when the Buddha was walking back to the bamboo forest monastery, you have to be mindful in your spiritual cultivation. Everything can be practiced. Everything can be a practice spiritually or to cultivate. Everything can be a way for you to grow. You just have to be mindful about what you're doing. Don't do things simply to do things. So when you're doing chores, try to see everything that you're doing. Anything that should be done and you see that it could be done, do it, right? Don't wait for someone to tell you. That is also a way to practice and cultivate. After eating, Sujata poured the Buddha some fresh water, and the Buddha offered the first drink to Savasti, and with that same cup, offer it to Sujata. So again, as the day progressed, you can see the lesson that the Buddha is trying to teach each of them. And I believe that the Buddha did this on purpose, because the Buddha had practiced mindfulness to perfection. So everything that he does had an intention, a purpose to it. And he was aware of every thought and every action that he did. And he wanted to teach Sujata that being an untouchable is simply an idea, a bias, a conception, like we talk about in previous chapters, that arose from our ignorant mind. And thanks to the Buddha, Sujata that day developed greater compassion and wisdom because she drank from the same cup as Savasti. Master had many points about this topic. Master elaborated on that we are not this body. But we should still treat this body as sacred. We shouldn't be selfish in using this body, but don't be stupid either, and use it wisely and with wisdom. It means that when we cultivate, we should take care of our body, because our body is a vehicle for us to grow spiritually. But we shouldn't be lazy about it. We shouldn't gain, like 300 pounds, for instance, and not worry about what food we put into our body, because it is a vehicle to grow. So, when we cultivate, whether it be doing chores, for instance, or eating, be mindful of everything that you do, and try to do everything you do with intention, with logic, and with wisdom. And it is also through this body that we are able to experience the world and transform that experience into our wisdom. That's why we should treat our body with sacredness and with respect. And another thing about this body, Master also mentioned, is that our body is full of conditions, meaning that it will always crave for the basic things of life, like food, like sex, like shelter. So even if you become enlightened, you will still crave for food. We will see that in previous chapter when the Buddha nearly died. We will touch upon this subject again. But one of the misconceptions Master mentioned that we have is that when we become enlightened, we don't crave things anymore. That's not true at all. We still crave because this body, we still have this body, and we still have to nourish it. That's why we crave those things. Master also mentioned that this body is a double-edged sword. We can use this body to help us attain enlightenment, but it's also through this body that we can create heavy, heavy karma and prevent us from growing spiritually. So that's why we talk about mindfulness. Do everything with intention, with logic, and with wisdom, and encode only good things so that we don't create bad karma. And then after teaching them those lessons that I mentioned before, the Buddha then proceeded to tell them the story of the time when he was a young boy and how he saved a swan that was shot out from the sky by his cousin Devadatta, who shot the swan with an arrow. So Devadatta was the one who shot the swan, and he wanted to take back the swan because he believed that the swan belonged to him because he's the one who shot the swan. But the Buddha didn't let him. The Buddha didn't see that the swan belonged to Devadatta because he saw that the swan was injured and he needed help. And because the swan needed help, he actually needed the Buddha more than Devadatta. So what can we learn here is that when we view things with kindness and compassion, we will act differently than if we view things with dominance and possession. For example, that story I just mentioned, Devadatta viewed the world with dominance and possession. He wanted to possess the swan and then kill the swan, right? The Buddha, on the other hand, viewed the swan through kindness and compassion, and he wanted to save the swan, to nurture it, to make it grow back to its full health and release it. So these are very important lessons, and many people in this world hold different viewpoints on several issues, whether it be politics or social issues or the environment, for instance. And depending on people's view, they will act differently. The Buddha viewed the situation from a position of understanding and compassion. And again, like I mentioned before, Devadatta viewed the situation from dominance and possession. So in our path in cultivation, one of the most important things you can develop is developing right view, which is one of the first 8 noble paths. Path number 1 is right view. Because your view will influence you to act in a certain way and pulls you towards a certain direction in life. So when you cultivate, you have to have right view. That is essential. And then Master jumped in and pointed out that having wrong view will only lead you to being a destructive person and create bad karma. We mentioned before that you should always encode good karma as much as you can. And one of the ways to encode good karma is to develop right view. Right view will eventually lead you to develop wisdom. And with wisdom, you can grow spiritually. So, the people of this world typically only act in a way that's only self-benefiting to them. Just like people who have wrong view. So, if you want to conquer or overcome and learn from your karma, you have to have right view. And like I mentioned, spiritual practice is the same way. You have to be able to let go of things so that you can accept your karma and slowly cultivate with patience and with right view. You will advance spiritually. And going to chapter 5. Sujata, this is the summary. Sujata meets the Buddha for the first time after finding him collapsed by the river shore. So Sujata meets the Buddha for the first time when he was about to die, and she slowly nursed him back to health with milk. So like I mentioned in the last chapter, in chapter 4, our body is still subjected to the desire of the body, even when we're enlightened. Even if you're enlightened, you still want to eat. You still want to have a more comfortable life, because that's what the body wants. That will never go away. So everything that happens in life and who we end up meeting, just like Sujata meeting the Buddha, is because of her past karma and her past merit. It was Sujata's destiny to meet the Buddha at that time. And through him, she was able to expand her wisdom and her compassion when the Buddha introduced her to Savasti. So a lot of people wanted to meet the Buddha, and a lot of people never had the chance. But Sujata met him, was able to meet him. That mainly partly due to her past karma and her past merit that she created in her past life. But one important point to note here is that when we push our body to the extreme, it can only damage our health, just like when the Buddha pushed his body to the extreme when he practiced asceticism and nearly died. And though the Buddha was able to push his body to the extreme situation, he realized that that is not the best way to seek enlightenment. But Master mentioned without putting himself into that extreme, he wouldn't recognize that, and the Buddha would be too lax to practice. Yet at the same time, if we don't put ourselves into the extreme situation, we don't learn. But like Master then further elaborate on, people nowadays in the modern time, they don't put themselves in extreme situations anymore. And people are actually extremely lax about spiritual cultivation. That could be probably due to many factors, but people nowadays, they don't really worry about spiritual cultivation anymore. Not a lot of people are cultivating. They're busy enjoying the materialistic world. Instead, Master recommends that people practice with moderation. Don't be too lax, or you won't learn anything. And don't be too extreme like the Buddha, because you might learn something, but you could die. So we can learn from the experience of past, you can say, enlightened beings, that you don't have to put yourself into the extreme situation to learn. But you also have to be diligent, like we talked about before, to grow. So after regaining some of his strength, the Buddha sat up, and Sujata, thinking that the man was a god, prostrate before him. So from this interaction, we can see that Sujata already had a heart of respect and sincerity in her. Because many people who meet an enlightened being still will not prostrate before them because their ego is too high. Like we mentioned before, a person's ego is a major obstacle that prevents them from advancing. Yet at the same time, Master taught that every situation has two sides of a coin. Yes, it is true that the ego can be an obstacle to stop you from progressing spiritually, but you can also recognize your ignorance and your stupidity through your ego. And through that experience, you can learn to correct your faults, correct your ignorance so that you can grow. So, prostration for Sujata, in that very moment Sujata was prostrating before the Buddha, she was cultivating respect. And like we said, she was slowly letting go of her ego, even for the briefest of moments. So the main lesson from that interaction is that people are born into this world naturally, with characteristics that enables them to practice spirituality more easily than, say, another person. But whether you have that characteristics or not, if you want to cultivate spiritually, you should do it diligently, with competence and with patience. Then, continuing with the story, the Buddha then lectured to Sujata that abusing the body or practicing extreme asceticism won't lead to peace, and it won't lead to enlightenment. So, Master also taught that, again, like we mentioned before, that this body is sacred and one of the most complex organisms ever to be created by the cosmic parent. So we can't ever control this body completely, even when you're enlightened. So because this body, the primary reason for its existence is to survive, right? Meaning that it will always want to eat, it will always want to have sex, it will always want to have shelter, and it will always crave the basic needs of life. So in cultivation, I guess the lower form is not to suppress, the lower form of cultivation is to suppress the desire, right? But the higher level of cultivation is actually to control it. Suppressing your basic need is only sweeping it under the rug, and eventually it will explode. So when you practice and you cultivate and you feel these needs for food, for sex arises, that's actually a very normal thing to have. And you shouldn't be afraid of it. You shouldn't try to suppress it. Just let it be. If you want to eat, go eat. Don't starve yourself to death like the Buddha when he practiced extreme asceticism, and it led him nowhere. It nearly killed him, actually. So Sujata, seeing that the Buddha who was still very weak, offered to bring the Buddha food every day so that he can eat and nourish his health. And the Buddha agreed. The Buddha also added that he would like to go to the village to accept food and beg for food as well. So originally I talk about begging for food as a way of practicing the way and a way to humble the ego. But Master then further elaborated on this that, well, I'd like to mention first that the Buddha didn't have to beg for food, actually. He was enlightened. But the reason why I think he begged for food was to set an example for the people who followed him, who practiced this with him, that begging for food is a way to practice. So by setting an example, by doing it himself, he actually encourages and reinforces that action in his followers. And as we can see, even in today's modern society, the Thai monks are also begging for food, and that's fostering faith and respect in the Thai people, and also fostering kindness and compassion as well. So the Buddha was actually setting an example for the people who follow him by begging for food, and simply not just people bringing food to him. He had to go out himself to beg for food. But Master then added some commentary, and he further elaborated that the Buddha went out to beg for food simply not to foster kindness and compassion, but it's also to build relationship with the people that he came into contact with. And he was also accepting food and eating food, whatever food that was given to him, to create faith in people, to create goodness in people, to create kindness and compassion in people. And the Buddha, being an extremely respected figure at that time, a respected religious figure at that time, Master mentioned that his begging for food was actually his own way of breaking the barrier between the caste system, because he begged for food not from only the rich and the noble, but also from the very poor as well. Continuing with the story, Sujata was very happy and delighted that she was able to offer food to the Buddha, because she felt that the Buddha was someone who had attained high spirituality, and when she offered food and to the Buddha, she was creating merit and blessings. But this is something that I pointed out, and Master corrected me, is for me, Sujata at that point still had a very greedy mind, and that is also a form of ignorance. But Master mentioned that having this greedy mind is not actually a bad thing. It depends on what your greed is. Doing good merit, or having a greedy mind to create merit with someone who's enlightened, is a way for a person to keep themselves on track to grow spiritually. Because a person who's begging, they know what they need. What they need at that point is for guidance, for merit, for blessings, for virtue. And so their mind is actually coming from a place of goodness rather than coming from a place of defilement. So for someone who's practicing spiritually, you shouldn't look down on people, like Master mentioned. You shouldn't look down on people who does ritual ceremonies, or people who beg for food, or who's only seeking to create merit and blessing. It is their own way of cultivating as well. Everyone is on their own path, and everyone has their own lessons to learn. So we shouldn't look down on people who has a greedy mind looking for merit and blessing, because it is also a way for them to cultivate. And at least when they're doing that, they're not going out and harming other people. So that is the end of chapter 5.